Hey everybody, John with Al, and welcome to the second part of our video all about suspension. In fact, this video is going to be about this, dampers. That's right, shocks, struts, whatever you want to call them. There's nuances to the different words, but we're all basically talking about the same thing. Now, if you didn't see our first video, it was all about springs, specifically leaf springs and sprinters, and why it's critical to get your spring in the correct spring window. Once you do that, this is going to make a world of difference. Now, this is what is called our Pro Series strut. And if you look behind me, before I explain what all this stuff does, you can see this is where your factory strut would go right here. And then this is what's called an auxiliary strut. And these look very, very different from the factory strut, which I'm going to show you in a moment. I'm going to show you the difference in both compression and rebound. Let's first talk about what's called sprung and unsprung weight. The wheel is unsprung weight, meaning if you hit an obstacle, the weight of that wheel has to be moved upwards by that obstacle. Whereas the vehicle itself is what's called sprung weight because it sits on top of the spring. If you don't have a shock absorber, if you will, absorb the shock, then that spring will oscillate and cause it to bounce like this. And when a tire or a wheel is not on the ground, it can't do you any good. It can't brake, it can't steer, it can't rock crawl. And so the purpose of a shock is to actually stop the spring from springing. What is that? Makes no sense. Why would you want to stop the spring? Well, if you've ever seen one of those really old vehicles that's a complete steaming pile and the shocks are worn out, and you either push on the back and the old shows and it would bounce, or it goes down the freeway with a wheel bouncing up and down, that's because the shocks are actually worn out. Why does it make a huge difference on a sprinter? Well, we add a ton of weight, which is why we have to adjust the springs, but it's also important to adjust the shocks and the dampers. So basically, this is going to be not only more robust, carry more fluid, but it's going to be tunable. Ours are adjustable because, as we talked about with certain other aspects of suspension, what you want off-road is oftentimes the polar opposite of what you want on-road. The same is true when it comes to these things. Let's talk about how a shock does what a shock does. So you have a compression. Now I've got a cutaway shock here, which is nice because I can use this, and we can talk more about what this looks like internally as we get more into this video. But this is a cutaway of a piggyback reservoir auxiliary shock. So that is this one up here. This is connected to both the vehicle, the sprung weight, and the axle, the unsprung weight. In a sprinter, the rear is a solid axle, and in the front, it's not, but that's kind of irrelevant. So as the spring allows this wheel to go up, that's called the compression. So if anyone's talked about shocks before, and you hear them talk about compression and rebound, well, this is your compression. Shockingly, the shock is compressed. It's a lot of puns. And this is what's called rebound. So it's, why they don't call it extension, I don't know, but it's called rebound. And the reason these are important is when you hit a bump and that wheel is fired up towards the sprung weight, the vehicle, this is going to let that wheel travel up along with the spring, which is then storing the energy. A shock itself will not push the wheel and the tire back down. The spring stores the energy, and then it goes to push the wheel and tire back into contact with the pavement. The only problem is it's going to bounce it off the pavement like a bouncy ball. The purpose of the rebound is to put that wheel and tire back on the ground in a controlled way. So theoretically, if your suspension is working properly, your spring will allow the bump to be absorbed with enough softness in the compression to allow that bump to be soaked up and not transferred into the vehicle. And then you're going to want to have the spring push that wheel and tire back down and have the rebound such that that wheel isn't fired into the ground, and it's also not too slow, because if it's too slow, this is compressed and then you hit another bump and then you have no suspension. So it's all a game of trade-offs. Sprinters are unique in that they're driven a large amount of miles on road, and they're also driven a large amount of miles off road. And when it comes to shock absorbers, you want something that's going to have firm valving or stiff valving for the road, because when you're on the road, you're not, hopefully, encountering large obstacles. the road, the freeway, unless you live in a place where the roads are totally trash, most of the things that you encounter on the road at speed are going to be, you know, an inch or less in height. Occasionally you'll hit a pothole or go over a speed bump. You're going much slower. It's a different scenario. But as far as driving, most of the paved surfaces are fairly flat. And so you're not going to want this shock to go all the way up and down. Vehicle would be really wallowy, would be the best way to describe it. And so on pavement, you're going to want firmer springs, but you're also going to want firmer shocks, basically shocks that are going to allow the wheel and tire to be put back on the ground faster over a shorter period of time. Now, when it gets to off-roading, you have much, much bigger things, literal obstacles to go over. You can have giant rocks the size of your tire, ledges, you know, divots and washes in the road. And for that scenario, you're not traveling at high speed, but you do want a large amount of travel. And so you're going to want to make your suspension soft. So you're going to want to go from a firmer setting to a softer setting. And that's going to allow this compression to go up slower, but more smoothly. And then the same thing coming down. It's not going to fire that tire at the ground like it might on a freeway over a small bump. When you're in the dirt, that is a very uncomfortable, harsh ride. So you want compliance is the word I use when you're in the dirt. You really want shocks that are going to articulate, or suspension that is going to articulate, move up and down in a smooth, controlled motion to keep traction. Whereas when you're on the street, you want a set of shocks and dampers that are going to give you good stability and feedback. That's kind of the high level discussion of shocks and dampers and so on. So let's talk more about how they work. We're in the lab. I've got my cheap Amazon lab coat on. I've got my glasses so I look smarter. Let's talk about how shocks actually work. And I think one of the most important aspects to look at first is kind of basic layout. So let's take a shock that we have. This is our auxiliary shock from like a Trail 2500, if you will. And you compare it to a factory damper. Now this is actually off the rear, but it doesn't really matter. They're basically the same in the front. They just have a different bracket on it. And the shape is what we're going to talk about here. This is a smooth body, and this is called a piggyback reservoir. That's because this is like a little piggyback. Isn't that cute? You also have remote reservoirs where this has a hose, like our trail flow kit for Grenadiers. But I want to explain why this is so much better than this. And obviously we're going to talk a little bit about the adjustment. That's a big part of it. But first, let's understand the basics of a shock, what's in it, how it works, etc. So I've drawn some incredibly gorgeous drawings on my board here that will allow you hopefully to understand how this works. I moved you in a little closer because this whiteboard can be a little bit hard to see, but inside a shock are really two things. Let's use pink. Pink's a good color. So you've got this area here, and if I hold up a piggyback reservoir with the cutaway, it's actually opposite this, but this area is this area here. And so I'm gonna shine a light so you can see it. See that orange piston in there? So what this area is called air. That's your gas. And on a smooth body shock, like is found on the Mercedes Sprinter, that's going to be this area here, and that's going to be your gas. Now there's a few different things you can fill this with gas-wise. Most good shock manufacturers use nitrogen, and the reason they use nitrogen is because air is hydrophilic and it contains water, and water can corrode things. Additionally, if you actually have water in it, as you heat it, it can expand a little bit more because the water can turn into vapor, etc. So that's why they use nitrogen in race car tires and actually in airplanes as well, because it's inert. So the tires on an airplane, should you have a blowout, won't catch fire. Anyway, so you've got a gas portion. What that gas portion is going to do, it's really going to add that soft compliance, because the rest of this, and I'm going to make the shock oil brown here. So we're going to color this whole area here. And we've got a tube over here, and then we got stuff here. And actually, I should have technically drawn some more valving here. Okay, So I didn't draw the oil over here. So immediately what you can see is that the sheer volume of oil in a piggyback shock versus a smooth body is massive. I don't know why I made that capital. I did it both. We'll go like that. So as I bring you in closer, you can see that the amount of oil in this piggyback shock in this demo is basically double. Now what it is exactly in the real world, I don't know. However, you can clearly see that, and this is a rear shock. So if I had a rear shock, this would obviously be longer. But the amount, this is just a shielding. So there's nothing in there but a piston. So you're talking about this portion here. It's not only skinnier, but you only have a small section of this that can contain oil. Why is that important? Well, anytime you have kinetic energy going into the shock, which is that compression stroke we talked about, you're gonna have fluid traveling back and forth through the valving, which we'll talk about shortly. That's going to create heat. When you create heat, you actually get less viscous oil, which means it's thinner, and it will then move through the valving more easily, which actually changes the valving of the shock. And so if you have it valved properly, but your oil gets too hot, it's actually gonna be a much softer valving than you intended because it's gonna flow through the valves much more quickly. And so one of the issues right away, just going from, or one of the advantages I should say, just going from a smooth body to a piggyback is just purely the amount of shock oil that you have to dissipate heat. That's gonna mean that your damper is gonna work more effectively on those washboard roads where it might be going up and down really quickly, frequently for a long period of time. Now let's talk about this gas area. What the gas area does, this, I kind of did it in, was it pink or red? It was orange. Remember I showed you this thing in here that was orange? So that moves up and down as this shock is compressed, right? So we're moving this up. That's going to allow a certain amount of oil past the valves, but liquids are not compressible. So oil, water, it's not compressible. It's one of the reasons hydraulics work. So as you move this fluid through the oil, if you try to move it really fast, this can't always travel, the oil can't always travel through the valve fast enough if the shock is compressed very quickly. And so what happens is this gas, which is much more compressible, ends up being kind of like a compliance or a cushion. And so this, as this would go up, oil would go down. I lost my brown. The oil would pass through the valves down here. And then what would happen here is this gas thing, or gas portion, if you want to be more technical with my Amazon lab coat on, gas thing. So this plunger might now be down here, and some of the fluid has now pushed more on that, and that is going to allow a bit of cushion because it's compressible. And so this gets dialed in the same way that your valving would get dialed in. And again, moving over here, you just lose room for everything. And when you have an empty cargo van, you only need so much dampening. But when you build them out into adventure vans, you have massively more load, especially on the rears. It's not firm enough, it's too soft. Just like the vans are undersprung, the dampening is underdamped. And so just changing the spring isn't gonna fix it, just changing the shock isn't gonna fix it. You really need to change them as a pair to get the back end working. But again, I go back to just the sheer volumes in a smooth body. You can't really accomplish great off-road performance or great on-road performance with all of your kind of limited capacities, etc. So now that we understand the shapes of the different shocks and how they work internally, let's look at the valve more closely. So in this one, there's actually two valves. So you've got a channel here that goes to a valve right here that will basically allow more or less fluid to pass through into the piggyback chamber. And then you've also got your valve in the main part of the body here. And that valve basically is offset cylinders that allow the oil through. And so if we were to kind of take a cutaway of that valve, so it's going to be like cutting a pizza in half here, you would have some parts of the valve would kind of be shaped like this, right? And that would be for oil. We've cut it in half like pizza. And then this would be for compression. This would be for compression because the oil would be traveling this way. And then this would be rebound because the oil would be traveling that way. And so what they do is they offset in that machined valve, they offset those holes. So you can see kind of, let me see, you can see two right there, and then you flip it and you see correspondingly a single on the bottom. And so that is how they kind of feed the fluid through the valving. So that's one way that you can change how a shock performs. You've also got these shims. Now they're really hard to see, but they're gonna be, do I have anything to point with? Not really. They're right below here. It's a little piece, see these little like washer-like things? Okay, so that's your shim stack. And your shim stack is kind of going to be something that is progressive. And what I mean is, as this goes up faster, we talked about it compresses the gas. But what also happens, and I'm gonna erase this, well, maybe let's move over here. I might need that later. So now if we look at the shim stack, you've got a valve, okay, way blown up. And then below it, so again, you've got holes in this, you know. Okay, so you got holes on both sides of that. Then below it, you have these stacks of shims. And oftentimes they will be like an upside down pyramid. These are blocking part of the flow through those holes. And so if you looked top down at a valve, you might see, you know, a hole like that, and then the shim would be like that. So it's partially blocking that hole. Let me bring this in close so you can see. So you see how that shim down here is partially blocking that hole and the fluid traveling through it. So this is the side view, this is the top down view. So what happens is, if the fluid is traveling really, really fast, right? So we get a really fast compression. So you hit a big bump and the shock has a lot of compression very quickly. It's called high-speed compression. It's really not high speed as in the vehicle's moving quickly. High speed as in the shock is being pushed through its stroke at a high rate of speed. So what happens is these shims they differ in thickness and they differ in size. And that's because, see how this is unsupported right here? So what you're gonna have happen as you have the shock travel faster, the fluid is gonna push on this shim and it's gonna deflect it. So the shim is gonna bend down, okay? I don't know if you can see that. So now we've got droopy sad shim, and it's supported by the shim below it. And the reason they do kind of an inverse pyramid is because, again, it's progressive. Just like, what does this look like? A leaf spring. Ever seen a leaf spring? It looks like this. It's an upside down pyramid. That's how we get progressive. And so what happens is, as this fluid comes through here, it will then push on this until a certain point where it will start to deflect this, and at a certain point it will start to deflect this. And so what happens when you tune a shock is you can change the valving, but you can also change the shim stack. And so by having this one upside down pyramid, it gives it less support. On the other hand, if you went to something that was more uniform, so you had a shim there, and a shim there, and a shim there, that's gonna be much firmer because this shim is gonna support the one above it. It's not gonna allow for much deflection. So it's gonna take a lot of force to deflect those shims. You can also change the thickness of them, and all of that is going to change the way that the shock performs. And so this is kind of critical when we talk about our suspension being tested and tuned specifically for vans and vehicles that are built out, that is a critical component in these shocks, that we change the valving and the shims. And while the outside of a shock can look nearly identical across vehicles, across companies, it's the internals of the shock that are really what matter when it comes to the performance on the vehicle. Now I want to get into adjustability. So let's go out into the garage real fast and we'll show you how these shocks here compare in compression and rebound force versus a stock damper.
Hopefully you can hear me. I came out here to the workshop because I want to demo the difference in the softness and firmness of the Owl Aero strut and the OEM strut. This is off the rear of a Mercedes, and I'm gonna, hopefully I can in fact get around here. I'm gonna tilt this down. Professional camera work every time, my friend. I'm gonna tilt this down. So what I'm gonna do is just demo this by pressing down, and you're gonna see the lack of dampening force on this shock. I barely had to push on it and it's all the way flat. It's simply not enough dampening for after you build one of these vehicles out and put a lot of weight in it. Now let's compare that to the soft setting on our suspension. So I can push it down, but it definitely requires much more force, probably about 50% more force than the factory damper. And then if we flip it over here to firm, it barely moves at all. And firm is what you're going to use when you're on road. So basically, that is why adjustability and having the correct tuned dampers for your vehicle are so important. Now we'll throw it back to that weird looking guy in the lab coat. I don't really like him.
So now you see why it's so important to upgrade your shocks. It's just the factory stuff is not intended for the weight of these vehicles. One of the cool things is on our Aero suspension are these adjusters. And that's because what you want on the street is oftentimes polar opposite of what you want on dirt roads. On the street, you want to have something that's pretty firm. And as I said earlier, on when you're off-road, you want something that's going to be compliant and allow those, lost my voice there for a second. You want something that's compliant, that goes over the different topography, dips, rocks, etc. And you're going to want this to be valved such that it moves more softly than you would when you're on the freeway. The problem with the factory one is it's just so soft that it's basically useless once you build it out. So again, let's talk about this adjuster. So on this cutaway shock, you can see in here that as I move this knob, I don't know if you can see, you see that going in and out? So that's actually a pin that's going in and out of a channel. So you might have a channel like this, and then you have a pin like this. And so by moving that pin in and out, if you move the pin up, you're gonna let more fluid go through that channel. Okay? So basically, there's two sets of valving on this shock. You've got the main valving that we've tuned already for you, and then you've got your adjusters here, which allow you to kind of set it up for off-road or on-road. And what those are doing is they're affecting how quickly the fluid can transfer from this section to this section. So if we go back to this drawing, right? If we make it harder for fluid to travel from here into this area, you're essentially making the valving firmer because the oil can't move as quickly, which is gonna firm up the shock for the road. And then as you adjust this to soft and that needle retracts, it's gonna allow more fluid to travel through here more freely. And that is going to make the shock softer on your compression and rebound, etc. So that's kind of the basics of how shocks work. We can geek out on this stuff for days, and there's obviously, suspension has been around for a long period of time. So there are variations of this that come in all forms and permutations. There's mono or smooth body shocks that have like spaces on the side where the fluid can travel instead of having it up there, etc. But the main thing that is important to what we do is the shock tuned for the vehicle. Is it adjustable so that it works well on road and off? And thirdly, now you understand how suspension works. So it can be pretty scary to look and take one of these apart, but now that you know what everything does, you know that that's a main valve and you've got the shim stacks there and some washers and you've got a piston that goes up and down there, and this adjustment is just moving this needle in and out. Once you have all that information, this really isn't that complicated anymore. And so now you're empowered, whether you choose to go with Owl Aero suspension or with another suspension out there, it's going to make your van massively better. But I wanted to make sure that you are armed with the information of how suspension works so that you can choose between the different options that are out there today. Hopefully you found this interesting. I've got a lot more suspension videos, and so check those out. I've got one on springs that was part 1. I'm gonna do one on compound brackets. If you're unfamiliar with that, it's really important. You definitely wanna watch that. And we have lots of other videos, so if you like those, subscribe, and that helps us.